I never thought I would live to see the day where I could actively say that I've seen a movie so historically inaccurate it makes the 1965 film The Battle of the Bulge look like a documentary. So, ladies and gentlemen, I finally watched Napoleon, Ridley Scott's latest historical epic, and I use historical in air quotes because, boy howdy, is this one of the most historically inaccurate movies I've ever seen. And that's really too bad because I was very hyped for this movie. From the moment it was announced, I was like, oh my God, we're getting a Napoleon movie. I get to see a movie about Napoleon on the big screen. And I did. I went to go see this in IMAX. And I was excited, even having heard all of these terrible, terrible reviews for this movie. I'm like, you know what? It's Napoleon. I want to see Napoleon on the big screen. And it's not like I'm biased towards Napoleon or anything. Yes, I am, ladies and gentlemen. When I was getting my my master's degree in history, I focused quite a bit on the idea of total war during the Napoleonic Wars and Napoleon himself. And my big thesis essay, I actually wrote about the 1813 spring and fall campaigns in Germany. I'm obsessed with Napoleon. You can see that I have a lot of biographies and a lot of Napoleonic Wars books behind me. I even have a little statue of Napoleon behind me. I love the Napoleonic Wars. Between the Napoleonic Wars and the American Civil War, those are two things that I love to obsess about, and I love to read about, and I love to learn more about, and I plan to do some videos about. So my letdown was tremendous when it came to this god-awful movie. I have never seen a movie depict Napoleon so wrong in my life. And there are tons of movies depicting Napoleon. He is literally one of, if not the most written about single human being other than Jesus on the planet is Napoleon Bonaparte. The filmmakers had a true lack of understanding of who he was as a character, what this era was as a whole, and the true drama behind the actual history. The actual history is more interesting than what is presented within the movie, and that is a big, giant problem. And a lot of this, I think, comes from the fact that you're trying to squeeze this man's life into one film. It's just too short. Napoleon's life is huge. It's vast. It's expansive. There's tons of characters in it. Can't put that into one 2.5 hour movie. For example, and because of this, it feels like a giant jumbled mess. And there's one part in particular where I really noticed it. There's a scene where Josephine comes back to Napoleon after he returns from Egypt, which, by the way, he did not return from Egypt because of Josephine. He returned from Egypt because he was saving his ass from being completely cut off by the British. Napoleon lets Josephine back in after he finds out that she's been cheating on him, which did happen. He basically looks at Josephine and goes, "You are nothing without me." She is nothing without him. It literally jump cuts to the next scene, and suddenly she's saying to him that he's nothing without her, and he's like, "Oh yeah, I am absolutely nothing without you." What the fuck happened there? There had to have been something that progressed in the middle between those two sequences for suddenly the roles to have completely reversed in such a dramatic way that we just don't see. And the movie is full of jarring edits like that just makes it an incoherent mess. And there's a lot of these little tiny lies, blatant lies that the film tells to try to truncate everything. And one that really aggravated me, because I'm obsessed with the 1813 campaigns in Germany, the Wars of Liberation as they're called there. I hate how this movie goes straight from Russia right into Napoleon's abdication with no exposition at all. And it blatantly says that the campaigns in Russia is what led to Napoleon's abdication. That's not true. It was the 1813 campaigns, particularly post-Battle of Leipzig, which I argue and continue to argue was Napoleon's greatest defeat. Not Waterloo, it was Leipzig. I would be okay with them just going from Russia straight to his abdication had they not said the line, "because of your disaster in Russia." Because that's just blatantly not true. That's just a giant fabrication for the sake of the narrative and missing a huge chunk of a dramatic part in Napoleon's life. just for the sake of getting from point A to point B. This has got to be the worst Napoleon I have ever seen put to film. The worst and laziest interpretation of Napoleon I have ever seen. There is no reason why you should be liking Napoleon as a human being. There's no reason you should be rooting for Napoleon as a human being. And because of that, there's no way for us to understand or comprehend how and why he became emperor, why and how his soldiers were so devoted to him, and how and why so many of them turned against their own country to join him when he returned from exile for the first time. There's none of that. Instead, what we have is Napoleon portrayed as a bumbling autistic incel. And it's so clear that Ridley Scott just does not understand the source material. I don't even think he read a single book about Napoleon, judging by the way how this goes, or even the historical advisors on this movie. I don't think read a single book on Napoleon or who he was in general. Hell, you can see behind me that I have Andrew Roberts' book on Napoleon, and just reading that alone should give you a good sense of who Napoleon was as a person, just because of the amount of letters that he uses as sources within that book. Just read that one book and you would create a better movie than what we got. This is as if you were in high school history for one day, and for one class you talked about Napoleon, and that's all you got out of it was that. You see, I've been sitting here and I've been chewing on this movie for quite a while, and it just isn't sitting right with me at all. This entire movie is just a giant character assassination of who Napoleon was. And admittedly, I am more pro-Bonapartist than most people that I know. I genuinely like a lot of what Napoleon did, particularly his reforms and his and the stuff that he did to embrace a lot of the Enlightenment movement, but yet not going crazy like Robespierre did. I genuinely do consider myself relatively pro-Bonapartist, but at the same time, how can you not be? I mean, Napoleon, if there's a life out there that doesn't need to be embellished by lies, and I do mean lies and fabrications for the sake of a narrative, it is Napoleon. And it's just so clear that, and Ridley Scott had the wrong mentality, I think, going into this, constantly comparing Napoleon to Hitler and any chance that he got, because that's the only other big dictator in modern history that we can possibly think of, right? Even though the comparison is completely wrong in every way, shape, and form, Ridley Scott was just the wrong man for this. He doesn't understand the source material. He doesn't understand Napoleon. He doesn't understand the wars around Napoleon. He doesn't understand the people around Napoleon. He doesn't understand Napoleon, which is important. You need to understand these people if you're going to make a biographical film about said person. It's just so clear that Ridley Scott just wanted Joaquin Phoenix to basically just play the Joker and not Napoleon. And considering the fact that he made up so many of these details and basically lied about Napoleon's entire career for the sake of this movie, you might as well have just made a completely fictitious film and not called it Napoleon. It's just very frustrating. It's very frustrating because, unfortunately, this is what people are going to see Napoleon as, because this movie has, granted, been relatively successful in the box office, and the only good that I can see coming out of this movie is it's going to get a lot of younger people interested in the actual history behind it. Unfortunately, this movie is going to end up being played in schools around the country, in Europe, and people are going to take it as gospel, and it's just not right. Now, Joaquin Phoenix is such a letdown, and he just misses the mark as Napoleon on almost every front right from the beginning, which is unfortunate, because when I heard that Joaquin Phoenix was going to play Napoleon, I was like, he could do it. But it's so clear that his interpretation of Napoleon, which undoubtedly lined up with Ridley Scott's interpretation of Napoleon, it just didn't work. He's just a bumbling idiot throughout the entire movie who's a cuck, who's getting dragged around by his wife and basically makes every decision of his entire career because he wants his wife's pussy, which just isn't true. I don't know how or why Ridley Scott came to that conclusion when it came to Napoleon, but it is so abhorrently wrong. You have a 2.5-hour movie to really emphasize this is why his men loved him, this is why France needed him, this is why France went with him as emperor, and yet they couldn't do it. And yet, I was in a group, and we just, in prep for watching Napoleon, we made the mistake of watching the 1970 epic Waterloo, which is, of course, what a lot of people, including myself, consider like the definitive Napoleonic War movie. And in that film, in the first 3 scenes, it beautifully and accurately establishes who Napoleon is, what his motivations were, and also displays why his men love him so much. In just 3 scenes in a 2-hour movie, we get it, we grasp it, done with very little dialogue, and a lot of it done with camera movement, editing, and just the facial reactions from the actors. And it's brilliant. The movie itself is just really brilliant. Screw Napoleon, Ridley Scott's Napoleon. Watch Waterloo instead. You will not be let down. And the fact that they could do that in just 3 scenes, while a 2.5-hour movie couldn't do it once, I think is very important to understand. The battles itself, the less said about them, the better. In fact, the big battle that this film likes that Napoleon depicts, that I'd like to emphasize on the most was, of course, the Battle of Waterloo, because that seems to be the only battle that anybody knows about when it comes to the Napoleonic Wars. However, I will say this. The much lower budget 2002 miniseries had a better and more accurate battle scene depicting Waterloo than this movie had with a gigantic $200 million budget. Don't even get me started. There were no trenches at Waterloo. Napoleon did not order that charge for the did not order that charge. It was Marshal Ney and all that crap. Napoleon himself did not take part in any charge, any cavalry charge, as far as I know, throughout his entire career. He was infantry and artillery. He wasn't cavalry. I don't really understand that whole thing, nor did he really carry a sword around with him all the time during this. Whatever, that's just nitty-gritty details, right? Even though it's a big part of his character. But you have to ask yourself during all these battles and everything like that, where are Napoleon's marshals throughout the whole damn movie? There's none there, and a lot of it, I think, is because they had to be left on the cutting room floor to try to fit Napoleon's life into a 2.5-hour movie, when they had a hard enough time doing that in a 4-part miniseries with a 6-hour runtime. How the hell are you going to do that for a 2.5-hour movie? You can't. You just can't. And because of that, Napoleon's marshals, who are a key and integral part of Napoleon's character and who he was as a human being, just aren't present. For example, in Napoleon, you see Davout, which is awesome because, fuck yeah, the Iron Marshal is a badass and I want to see him more. We don't even learn his name in the film. The only reason why I know he was Davout is because, it's the guy with the spectacles and kind of the chubby face. And it's like, that's clearly Davout. But the average moviegoer ain't gonna know who that is. That's just Joe Schmo Marshal in the background. We don't even know if he is a marshal. The only reason why I know he's a marshal is because I know the uniforms and I know the batons. They don't even put the marshals where they're supposed to be. For example, you see Marshal Davout at Napoleon's abdication. He wasn't there at all during Napoleon's abdication. He was fortifying Hamburg at the time, and he was being besieged. Nor was Talleyrand. Talleyrand was in Paris at the time, I believe, trying to open the city. And that was the whole reason why Napoleon abdicated in the first place, because he lost Paris. Betrayed by Fouché and Talleyrand. I bring this up, and why I say the 2002 miniseries depiction of Waterloo is better is because it used its lower budget to its advantage. So what it did is it showed some parts of the battle, but kept it relatively low-key and very personal. It would cut back and forth to the fight over La Sainte and stuff like that, and then it will cut to Napoleon in his tent trying to beat the British before the Prussians can arrive, which, granted, the Napoleon 2023 movie did. At least the 2002 series had La Sainte in it, and Hougoumont. At least it mentions those, and not just one giant open field with trenches in it that with battle tactics that look like it should be from World War I and not the Napoleonic Wars. The 2002 version is flawed, but at least it's extremely personal, and you can get a good sense of the tension that Napoleon felt because you know how much is riding on him. The 2002 miniseries knew focus on your main character, focus on Napoleon, and that helped. It's actually a good example of less kind of being more. But there's no Marshal Ney, there's no Murat, there's no Suchet, there's no Lannes, there's no Soult. None of these guys apparently exist, according to the Ridley Scott movie. And you'd think they'd want to incorporate, especially these two, Berthier and Lannes. You'd think they'd want to incorporate those two, considering how much of a huge impact they had on both Napoleon's career and Napoleon as a human being. He considered both of them dear friends, especially Lannes. And Lannes' death left a huge impact on Napoleon and many of the decisions that he would make going forward from that point. It left a huge hole with him that he couldn't quite fill with his other marshals. And that's an entire realm of dramaticism that the film doesn't bother with, because it might depict Napoleon in a somewhat positive light. But there's no Murat whatsoever, which is big, because the coup, Napoleon's coup, is a big part of this movie. And Murat had a big hand in the actual coup, but he's not even mentioned and not even brought up within the movie itself. And in fact, the entire coup scene kind of just drove me nuts. How it depicts Napoleon is so... It makes him look like a coward. Him screaming, him running, him just scared and nearly crying and confused. And I'm like, that's just not true. There was a lot of confusion on that day. Quite frankly, the coup completely almost unraveled just because nobody seemed to know what the hell was going on. Everyone seemed confused. But you can't convince me that Napoleon would have acted the way that he did. With all the records that we have about the coup, nowhere does it say Napoleon. Why would you want to follow Napoleon, seeing him groveling on the ground, scared that somebody might have stabbed him, considering the fact that this is the guy who has had horses shot out from under him, had at that point charged in front of all of your men, waving a flag, trying to get them to go forward. A man who's been shot at countless numbers of times thus far. You mean to tell me that a little knife is going to scare him to the point that he's a quivering mess on the ground, screaming bloody murder? No. Now, a lot of these details could be left on the chopping room floor. It's quite clear that Ridley Scott and the writer really wanted the emphasis to be on Napoleon and his relationship with Josephine, which is fine, by the way. We've had movies about Napoleon and his escapades with other women in the past. Probably the most notable one that I can think of is the film Desiree, made in the 1950s, where Marlon Brando plays an excellent Napoleon. That is the direction that this movie should have taken, is what I'm trying to say. If you're going to make a movie about Napoleon and his relationship with Josephine, you needed to go the Desiree route. It only focuses on the romance. And the key is that you use all of these battles, you use this news, you use all of this stuff like Austerlitz and all this stuff, the political climate, you use that as the backdrop. It is not the focus of your piece. Unfortunately, it seemed like the writers and Ridley Scott could not make up their mind which they wanted to do. Because if you just had a movie literally just depicting the relationship between Napoleon and Josephine, that would be a dynamic film. It would be a dynamic and dramatic film, because that's exactly what their relationship was. It was unbelievably dramatic and unbelievably chaotic and unbelievably passive-aggressive in many ways, shape, and form, and not the ideal relationship. Josephine eventually kind of became resolved to the fact that Napoleon can sleep around while she can't, but at the very beginning, yeah, she was sleeping around with everybody. She was a bona fide slut, especially at the beginning, and Napoleon absolutely resented her for it, but apparently Napoleon loved her so much. Napoleon's last words were "Army, head of the army, Josephine." He listed, as some romantics would like to say, I don't know if I completely agree with this, but some people who really subscribe to the Napoleonic myth like to say that those were his three loves in life, the army, being the head of the army, and Josephine. So clearly he at least had some level of affection for this woman. They used that quote at the very end of the movie. Following that line, we get a list of all of those killed within a series of big battles fought during the Napoleonic Wars to make it look like Napoleon is the worst human being ever, despite the fact that literally almost all of those wars were declared on Napoleon, not the other way around. But it seems like this movie has confused a couple of terms. There is a difference between casualties and those killed. Being killed in battle is not the same as being a casualty. And I can't believe whoever did this doesn't know the differences between being killed and being a casualty. It mentions Waterloo down at the very bottom, and it puts in parentheses there, in just one day. But wait a minute, if you look at the battles above it, so was Austerlitz and The other one that comes to mind was Borodino. Both of those were just one day. Why didn't it say that there? Like, it's worse than getting it wrong. It's the apathy and the utter lack of interest in the source material, in the actual history, that is what drives me absolutely nuts. If you have something, right, and it's not historically accurate, not even very historically accurate, there's tons of mistakes throughout the entire movie that deviate from what actually happened during the event, but it still manages to capture the essence and the aura and the spirit of the events it is depicting, I will still say it is a good historical movie. There's two films that I like to cite that come to mind when it comes to this. One you will definitely know. The other one you might not really know. One is Zulu. Not a very historically accurate film at all. Many of the characters, while they share the names of the real people, aren't based on people. Their characteristics aren't based on the real people at all. Many of the events that happened within the film itself didn't happen in real life or were heavily embellished upon, and yet it still feels and captures the spirit of the battle, of the people who fought at the battle. It both respects the Zulus and makes us terrified of them. And it also, you get up and close with these British soldiers literally fighting for their lives. And I think it captures the essence of that. The other one is the battle at Remagen, which is the case of where none of the characters in that movie are real people. The events that it depicts are very accurate, and I think it beautifully captures the aura of what was actually happening during that battle. Again, despite a lot of the events and as they transpired, not really working out like that in the real history. It still captured the essence and spirit of what the battle at Remagen was. Because to talk about Josephine just for a little bit, Josephine, she's way too young. I don't know what possessed them in this movie, because in reality, she was Napoleon's senior by a decent amount. The actress that they got in this movie is made up to look like, and is indeed at least 20 years younger than Joaquin Phoenix, and she definitely looks it, so that kind of scratches my head, and also eliminates an entire dramatic essence to their relationship that I think would work really well within a movie itself. Now, to me, you can't actually top Isabella Rossellini as Josephine. She was from the 2002 miniseries. I think she was the right age, but you can really still see, despite her age, her seductiveness, how she was able to get Napoleon to kind of wrap around her finger, and vice versa. You really understand that, and you also kind of get her political class as well. But she is not what made Napoleon do most of what he did. Napoleon did not return from exile to appease and try to reunite with Josephine. Josephine was actually dead by that time. She had died long before Napoleon returned from exile. Just imagine how interesting that would have been if Napoleon was depicted as a man who literally has nothing left to lose, because that's exactly what he was. He was a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose, was willing to risk it all for one last great hurrah during his 100 days. And it's one reason why I'm so obsessed with Napoleon's 100 days. The few things that are good within this movie do come from this relationship dynamic established within the film. Napoleon being an autistic simp incel is totally untrue. Especially later in his life. Later in his life, he was actually quite a successful womanizer, and many women who he slept with became unbelievably devoted and loyal to him, including Mary Louise, his second wife. But it makes sense from a dramatic standpoint of why I'm okay with starting him off as being like this weird, slightly creepy individual, because it adds to his character, and you can see his character grow. In fact, if you read Andrew Roberts' book, and you read even Adam Zamoyski's book, you can see that development happening. I loved him staring. I loved him sort of stuttering over his words and him sort of rehearsing in the mirror to try to get it to work. Him being really bad in bed. We have documentation. He was all of that when he was young. He was awkward with women. He was terrible in bed. He was extremely devoted to Josephine, despite Josephine literally sleeping with anybody with a cock that happened to walk into her house. Sure, Napoleon probably was kinky. That's fine. Go ahead and keep all that. Keep all that stuff, but have it be a part of his character and not just him being creepy. It's not that difficult to do. It's not that difficult to actually stick to history and still be it extremely dramatic. Because it is dramatic. But the key is that at the beginning, you make him sort of this incel kind of like character. You make him this shy, timid man in bed. And by the end, you have him being the womanizer that he became. and have it sort of parallel with him being emperor and the trials and tribulations of him becoming emperor and him actually being emperor and then it leading to his downfall. That should have been what the character arc is, but unfortunately we just don't have any of that. Napoleon is the same from beginning to end in this movie. And he's just a creepy, incel, autistic man. And I say autistic in the literal sense. Like, it's very clear that that's how Ridley Scott was directing Joaquin Phoenix. Act like you have autism. Because there were hints of this within the movie itself. In fact, the first 15 minutes of this movie, I was actually excited. I was like, oh, you know what? Maybe a lot of these reviews are just over-exaggerated rage. Because the first 15 minutes, I liked what I was seeing. I was liking this awkward Napoleon. I was liking this man kind of coming into his own and stuff like that. Like at the Battle of Toulon, despite that being grossly inaccurate in terms of the events that happened, I did like the fact that we see Napoleon scared. We see him mumbling to himself, I must be brave, I must be brave, I must be brave, or something equivalent to that. And I liked seeing that. And him pulling through nonetheless and being brave and leading his men into battle. Because we see the beginnings of what made Napoleon Napoleon. And I liked that. I dug it. It's just the film didn't bother to follow through with that, instead focusing and hitting us over the head with a sledgehammer time and time again that, yes, Napoleon was just creepy. He was the Hitler before Hitler. He was just an incel. He was just a bumbling idiot. Instead of actually doing something more nuanced, instead of actually trying to present the history for what it was, and instead of trying to actually do Napoleon justice. Because he is a complex character, he is a complex man. Probably no one other than Napoleon himself will ever fully understand who Napoleon was. The one thing that I think this movie absolutely nails when it comes to Napoleon, and I was genuinely shocked at how well this played out. I think this movie nailed how Napoleon acted with the birth of his son. Seeing Napoleon holding his son and he starts weeping and crying with joy, having a son, I think is very accurate to what the real Napoleon was experiencing at the time. And it's actually a very good scene. I love the fact that they actually show Napoleon holding his son and sort of walking around the maps while he's talking to his marshals and stuff like that, because there's actually a lot of evidence to show that Napoleon did just that. I mean, a lot of his guard and a lot of the generals and his aides and everything like that, they started referring to Napoleon's son as the eaglet. But the fact that Napoleon would often be seen in camps and stuff like that with his kid on his shoulders, and he would be acting like he was a horse. It's so clear that Napoleon thought the world of his son. And it's one of those things that just gets dropped in this movie. His son was his life. It's one of the best lines in Waterloo, is when Napoleon looks and he goes, "My son is my future." I love that line. It perfectly sums up Napoleon's mentality and gives him the excuse as to why he's doing what he's doing, and lets the audience know why he's doing what he's doing throughout the 100 days and why he returned and all of that jazz. Completely gone and ignored. Not just gone, ignored in the 2023 film. And it is just such a letdown, because that is such a dramatic and important part of Napoleon's life. But it was one of the few moments in Ridley Scott's movie where I actually thought Napoleon was human and not just a psychopath. This movie did do an absolutely wonderful job at actual representation of what solid shot and canister actually looks like. There's no plume of fire when it comes to explosions, when it comes to solid shot. You just see a giant cloud of dirt and debris go kind of splattering in every single direction. I genuinely like that. And of course, the canister. Any chance I get to see Napoleon kill me a bunch of royalists immediately gets an A in my book. But the last thing I do want to absolutely praise about this movie, in fact, I think it is my favorite element of this movie on the whole, Martin Phipps, his score is the best part of this movie. It is phenomenal. It's wonderfully atmospheric. It's big and grand in many parts. I love that choir. My favorite track from the soundtrack, by the way, is called Downfall, which plays during the Battle of Waterloo. Martin Phipps deserved better. He's one of my favorite composers, by the way, working today. He also did the score for the BBC, I believe it came out in 2012, that War and Peace film. A very similar score to this in many ways, including the choir and everything like that. Doesn't surprise me. In fact, that's probably why he actually got hired to be the composer. He's just good at doing period piece music. I also love the use of actual period piece music throughout this movie. I love the French Revolution music and everything like that. It's fun. In fact, it was the point I was kind of singing along with it because I recognized some of the songs. What a nerd. My God. So I've done enough ranting and raving about Napoleon 2023. People online, if you want more in-depth stuff, have already gone through with a fine-tooth comb over all of the historical inaccuracies when it comes to Napoleon, and they can do a much better job at it than I ever could or ever could dream of. So I highly recommend that you check those out because the list is long, gentlemen. In fact, Andrew Roberts did an interview where he said only 38 minutes of this movie, again, a 2.5-hour movie total, is historical accurate. So only 38 minutes, he noted, of this movie is actually accurate to what history really was. I'm done ranting and raving about this movie. I want to move on to something positive to cleanse my palate of this train wreck of a movie. It does feel weird just complaining about a movie this entire time. I don't like that. Again, I just really like talking about stuff that I like, not stuff that I dislike. I'm a Bonapartist. I love Napoleon. I love reading about Napoleon. It's my favorite era to learn about. And this movie failed in every way, shape, and form. If you like what you saw, hit the subscribe button. All of my social media is in the description below. In the end, this is Adwin Noise of AN Productions saying sayonara.